Imagine opening your eyes to the first glimmer of dawn, only to find a man standing before you, wielding a heavy axe, his shield scarred by countless battles. A man whose very name made the kingdoms of Europe tremble. This is the Viking we are accustomed to seeing in stories and films, a warrior who knows no fear, who refuses to acknowledge weakness, and who never backs down in the face of death. But what if I told you that this very same man, when the night swallows the last rays of daylight, becomes a vulnerable human being, shivering from the cold, terrified that this night might be his last, not from an enemy's sword, nor a lethal arrow, but from the wind, the water, and the frost that slowly creeps into his bones, nearly stealing his breath away. It is a paradox that is hard to believe, yet it is the hidden truth behind the legendary image of the Viking. And perhaps here lies the most intriguing question of all. How did these men even manage to sleep? Lying on fully exposed wooden planks in the merciless expanse of the North Sea, battered by freezing rain and howling winds, with no roof to shelter them and no walls to shield them. How did they not turn into frozen corpses before ever reaching the shores of their enemies? Every time I try to picture the scene, I realize that merely surviving a single night out there might have been more grueling than fighting an entire battle. What is even stranger is that we so often speak of the raids they launched and the cities they burned to the ground, yet we rarely pause to ask what happened to them when the clash of battle faded, when silence fell, and their true enemy became the sea itself. I believe that these small details reveal more about their human nature than any military victory ever could, because they strip away the mask and expose the men behind the myth. In this documentary, we will not recount the tale of a battle, nor will we trace the path of an invasion. Instead, we will live alongside these men, night after night, to discover how they fought off the cold, the exhaustion, and the fear, and why simply surviving until dawn was a triumph as hard-won as any victory on the battlefield. If you are fascinated by this hidden side of history, the history that films ignore and books rarely dwell upon, then subscribe now to the Obscure Dossier channel, because our journey tonight will not only reveal how the Vikings slept, but it will make you look at one of the most fearsome civilizations in history through a lens you have never looked through before. You step inside the ship for the first time, and you notice something that might seem strange if you look at it through the eyes of someone living in our time. There are no sleeping cabins, no roof to shield you from the rain, and no space to hide from the wind. Just long wooden planks surrounded by water on every side, as if whoever built it never once considered the comfort of those who would spend long weeks aboard. But the truth is entirely different. This was not a lack of skill, but rather a precisely calculated decision. For the Vikings did not want a comfortable ship. They wanted a ship that arrived first. Every extra piece of wood meant more weight. Every wall built on its deck meant more wind resistance, and every roof added to it meant precious seconds that could be lost while approaching the coast or retreating after a raid. And in a world where speed could mean the difference between life and death, agility became more important than comfort, and perhaps even more important than safety itself. That is why the longship came with a design that seems simple, yet carries a tremendous amount of genius. A narrow hull that slices through the water with ease, and a shallow draft allowing it to approach beaches and rivers that larger ships could not reach. The crew could row it if the wind died down, or hoist its sail in moments when the right wind blew. It was not merely a means of transport, it was a complete weapon designed to give its owners a lightning-fast advantage before their enemies even realized what was happening. But every advantage comes at a price, and here begins the paradox that few talk about. The moment the sun dips below the horizon, this engineering marvel turns into a brutal test of survival. The open deck that gave them the speed to attack all day long suddenly becomes an open door to every freezing breeze, every drop of rain, and every wave crashing off the side of the ship. It feels as though nature was reclaiming what man had taken from it in broad daylight, as if saying to them, "You have won the battle of speed, but the night is my battle." Imagine yourself sitting on those wooden planks, separated from the freezing water by only a few centimeters of damp wood. The wind finds no barrier in its path, striking your face, your chest, and your legs all at once, and the moisture slowly seeps into your clothes until the fabric itself becomes a source of heat loss. It is then you realize that the ship is no longer a vessel carrying you across the sea, but has become the arena where the sea tests your endurance. What is remarkable is that the Vikings understood this truth from the very beginning, yet they accepted it willingly, because they knew that any attempt to make the ship more comfortable would strip away the very reason that made it exceptional in the first place. It is a cruel equation. The faster the ship became, the harsher the night became for those aboard, and the more you sought to protect the men from the cold, the more you lost the ability to take your enemies by surprise. As darkness falls, the nature of the battle changes entirely. There is no longer an army to face, no fortress to attack, and no swords clashing before you. Your opponent has become something that cannot be struck by an axe, nor pierced by a spear. The freezing air, the water, and time, enemies that do not cease their attack for a single moment and give you no chance to strike back. In those long hours, the sword loses its value, and the strength of a man's arm is no longer what determines who will survive until morning. Instead, the ability to withstand the wrath of nature becomes the true weapon, and every night the crew spends on this exposed deck turns into a silent battle heard by no one. Yet it was perhaps more brutal than many of the battles immortalized by history. Temperatures begin to drop further, and you realize that resisting the cold is no longer a matter of comfort, but a matter of life or death. Here, something happens that you would never expect if you only knew the famous image of the Viking. For that warrior who stood tall by day, wielding his axe with all his pride, is no longer thinking of glory, nor of spoils, nor even of his reputation among men. All that occupies his mind is a single question: how to survive until the break of dawn. This scene might seem strange at first glance, but it reveals a profound aspect of human nature. When true danger approaches, pride takes a step back, and the survival instinct comes to the forefront. And this is exactly what happened aboard those exposed ships. There was no room for pretense or putting on a show of strength, because the frost does not distinguish between the commander and the youngest crew member. Before it, everyone is equal. That is why the men would bring out whatever sheep, deer, or reindeer skins they carried, and each would wrap his body in whatever he had available. These were not sleeping bags in the sense we know them today. Rather, they were primitive covers made to retain as much body heat as possible. Natural skins insulated against the wind far better than many of the fabrics they possessed, and the goal was not for a man to feel warm, but to prevent his body from losing what little heat it had left. And the difference between the two is vast, because survival on those nights sometimes meant settling for the minimum of losses just to stay alive. But even these skins were not always enough. The icy air would find its way into every gap, and the moisture would slowly seep into the fibers. As the hours passed, the body would begin to lose its heat despite all precautions, and here the crew reaches a decision that perhaps felt harsher to their souls than anything else. The men move in silence, then draw closer to one another until their shoulders almost touch. A little later, the contact becomes intentional, then necessary. Every body presses against another, not out of affection, nor out of comfort, but because human body heat has become the only resource the sea has not yet managed to steal. The scene might seem strange if we look at it through the eyes of the present, but in that era, it was one of the most logical methods of survival. The heat lost by one body might grant another body the chance to carry on. I feel that this moment alone is enough to shatter many of the images we have painted of these men, because we are used to imagining the warrior always standing alone, independent, needing no one, while the truth says the exact opposite. In the harshest hours of the night, not even the strongest man on the ship was capable of surviving alone. Rather, his life depended on the man he pressed against for warmth, as if nature was teaching them a lesson no battle ever could. A human being, no matter how strong, remains in need of others. And perhaps for this reason, solidarity among them was not merely a moral value, but a necessity forced upon them by the sea. For he who isolates himself from his comrades on such nights does not prove his courage, but only increases his chances of perishing. As for the one who accepts letting go of his pride and shares what remains of his body heat with others, he grants himself a new chance to see the sunrise. As the night wears on, no one cares anymore about who was the bravest during the day, or who wielded the largest axe, or who claimed the greatest number of victories. All these distinctions melt away in the face of the cold, and only one standard remains: who can hang on until morning. In my opinion, this is one of the most profoundly honest human truths in the life of the Vikings. For the frost was capable, in just a few hours, of tearing down all the masks a man creates for himself and returning him to his primal truth, a fragile creature searching with all he has for a warmth to keep him alive.
As the night deepens, every sound begins to fade, until even the roar of the waves itself becomes familiar after long hours. But inside every man aboard the ship, a battle rages that no one hears. It is a battle with something that appears on the surface to be a blessing, but on that night it could turn into a death sentence. Sleep. This might seem strange to us today, for we seek sleep whenever we feel exhausted. But there, in the heart of the cold sea, deep sleep was something men feared as much as they feared the storm. Because when the body completely surrenders to rest, its movement slows and it begins to produce less heat. And with the relentless wind and moisture, every minute a man spends submerged in deep sleep becomes another step toward his body losing its temperature, and perhaps toward a silent end from which the morning sun will never wake him. That is why their nights did not know the sleep we know. No one closed his eyes in peace. Rather, the hours of the night consisted of short naps, after which a man would wake up suddenly, sometimes because of a wave crashing against the side of the ship, sometimes because of a gust of cold wind, and sometimes because his own body could no longer bear the drop in temperature, as if nature refused to grant them complete rest, insisting on keeping them suspended between wakefulness and sleep until the break of dawn. And I feel that the hardest part of it all was not just the cold, but the exhaustion that accumulated night after night. Imagine your body screaming for sleep, every muscle in you wishing to relax, if only for a few hours, while your mind constantly whispers, "Do not surrender completely, not now, not in this place." It is a real war, but the enemy this time is not in front of you, but inside your head. As the days pass, fatigue begins to alter a man's perception of the world around him. Eyes that have not had enough rest might misperceive things, and shadows on the surface of the water might look like approaching ships, and the sound of the wind could turn in an instant into distant whispers or calls. We know today that prolonged sleep deprivation combined with cold and exhaustion can push the mind into hallucinations and a distorted sense of reality. The Vikings may not have known the scientific explanation for this, but they knew its effects all too well through experience. For this reason, the crew members did not merely watch the sea, they watched each other as well. If a man remained silent for too long, or his gaze seemed vacant, or his responses became sluggish, his comrades realized that fatigue was beginning to defeat him. And in such conditions, a small mistake in gripping an oar, or a moment's delay in tightening the ropes, could turn into a disaster threatening the entire ship. Fatigue did not threaten the individual alone, it threatened everyone. Imagine that moment, your head growing heavier and heavier, and your eyelids resisting with difficulty. You feel sleep pulling you down, as if it were another sea slowly drowning you. A part of you begs to surrender, to sleep, to forget the cold and the wind, if only for a little while. But another part realizes that this rest might be your last, and that closing your eyes for longer than you should could mean that your body will never wake up again, or that the entire ship will pay the price for your absence in a moment when it needs every hand and every eye. And perhaps for this reason, the nights of the Vikings were not merely a wait for morning, they were a long war of attrition, won by those who could resist themselves before resisting the sea. For there, upon those unforgiving wooden planks, survival was not only for the physically strongest, but for the most capable of holding on to a thin thread that separates wakefulness from death until the first light of dawn appears on the horizon.
And after everything you have seen, a question might come to mind no less perplexing than all that preceded it. Why did these men agree to throw themselves into this hell in the first place? What drives a rational human being to leave his home, the warmth of his family, and the safety of his village, to spend weeks or months upon a merciless sea, knowing full well that death might beat him to the shore even before he lays eyes on his enemy? It cannot be denied that every man had his own story. Some set out in search of trade, others wanted to prove their standing among their people. But many of those journeys were also driven by the glitter of spoils, the dream of quick wealth, and the desire to immortalize a name among warriors. The hope for gold, silver, and distant lands was enough to make a man accept a risk from which he might never return home. And this is a human nature known throughout all ages. When the fleeting gains of this world gleam in the eyes, the price sometimes appears much lower than it truly is. But the sea, it seems, reminded them every night of a truth no human can escape, no matter what weapons he carries and no matter what strength he possesses. He is, in the end, a fragile creature who can be brought to his knees by a single wave or an unseen freezing wind. It is truly astonishing that the man whom entire cities feared could become utterly helpless in the open sea to protect himself from a freezing breath of air. It is then that all balances shift, and the illusions of control that man clings to simply fall away. As I contemplate these scenes, I cannot help but feel that there is a lesson here that transcends the Vikings themselves. This is not merely the story of a people who lived over 1,000 years ago. It is a mirror reflecting human nature in every era. How often does a person chase something they believe will bring them happiness, only to discover, when it is too late, that they have paid from their health, their peace of mind, or their lifespan far more than they should have? And how often does the illusion of this world deceive us, making us forget the true cost of the path we walk? Perhaps the greatest revelation of this journey is that man, no matter how high his status, remains entirely dependent on the mercy of his Creator at every moment. He is not protected by his strength, nor his wealth, nor his fame, but he is protected by God alone. If the Almighty were to leave him to his own devices for even the blink of an eye, he would be powerless to resist the cold of the night, the wave of a sea, or an unseen illness. This truth echoes throughout all history, yet we so often overlook it while living in the warmth of our homes. Reflect on your own condition right now. You might be listening to this documentary under a roof that shelters you, in a warm room, on a comfortable bed, and perhaps this seems like an ordinary thing, unworthy of a second thought. But if a person were to live just one single night in the conditions those men endured, they would realize that warmth is a blessing, that safety is a blessing, that shelter is a blessing, and that the peaceful sleep we take for granted every night without fear is among the greatest blessings God has bestowed upon us, so much so that we only feel their true value when we lose them. And for this reason, I believe that what lingers most in the memory after this story are not the names of the raids, nor the size of the spoils, but this profound lesson, that no matter how much the world tempts a person with its allure, it is never worth losing one's soul for it, and that the more the heart is attached to its Creator, the more it gratefully receives the blessings at hand. Blessings one might view as small, but are in truth treasures that many people live their entire lives without ever realizing their immense value.
Rather, he carries its scars with him wherever he goes. The oars come to a halt, and the men slowly stand, their bodies stiff from the bitter cold, their hands cracked by the salt water, and their eyes heavy from hours without true sleep. The sea had drained everything it could take from them, leaving nothing in their chests but immense fatigue, suppressed anger,
and a will that knows no retreat. I feel that this specific moment is where the legendary image of the Viking, immortalized by history, was truly born. For when you stand on solid ground, having just survived a sea that tried to kill you all night long, the fear of men diminishes greatly. What is the threat of facing a man with a sword when you have spent the past hours facing the wind, the frost, and the waves with nowhere to hide? For these men, the battle was not the hardest part of the journey. It was the reward that came after the ultimate test. That is why, when their ships began to approach the shores of Europe, the kingdoms there were not facing men who had just woken from a peaceful sleep or a comfortable life. They were facing men who had wrested their survival from the heart of the sea, men who had lived through long nights knowing nothing but cold, hunger, exhaustion, and waiting until pain became something familiar to them. And perhaps this is why their ferocity in combat seemed so terrifying. It is easy to describe what happened next as brutality, but if we reflect on the path that led them to that moment, we find that it was not born suddenly. It was shaped slowly, night after night. Every wave broke a piece of their fear. Every sleepless night stripped away a part of their sensitivity to pain. And every dawn they survived death made the idea of taking risks on the battlefield seem far less daunting. It is an observation worth pondering, for a person accustomed to facing the harshest of conditions sees the boundaries of what constitutes danger entirely shift. And when their feet touched the shore, the sea did not leave them as they were. Rather, it spat out men it had reshaped in its own way, men who had learned that survival is not granted, it is seized, and that mercy is not something to be expected from nature. Therefore, it was no surprise that all those hours of deprivation, fear, and cold exploded in the first moments of the attack, as if everything pent up in their chests throughout the voyage had finally found its way out. Perhaps for this reason, many of their contemporaries misunderstood the secret of their strength, thinking the Vikings felt no fear or that they felt no pain, but the truth was different. They felt fear more than anyone else. They knew the cold more than anyone else, and they tasted the cruelty of the sea to the very last drop. But they learned to press on despite it all. This is the very idea that forged their reputation. They were not men who did not know death. They were men accustomed to looking it in the eye every night, only to wake up in the morning and keep moving forward once again. And when we look at their story from this angle, we realize that the legend was not born on the battlefields alone. It was born long before that, upon those narrow wooden planks in the vast expanse of the North Sea, where every night was a silent battle, and every dawn was a small victory over death. And for whoever succeeds in conquering that hell, most human battles will seem like nothing more than the continuation of a path they began the moment they set sail into the unknown.